Hey, welcome once again to the Manument Podcast with Glenn Johnson, financial advisor. And if you want more information on the services that Glenn can offer for you and get some advice from Glenn, you should go to his website at jbezfinancial.com. I want to kind of jump into this particular show and talk about the recent NFL draft. I mean, it happened, just some time ago, but the Buffalo Bills and their first pick was Florida State wide receiver Keon Coleman. And he signed a $10 million contract.
Wow.
And it was really interesting because while they were doing the press conference and he's sitting there talking, somebody kind of brought up and they're like, what about that jacket? That looks like an expensive jacket you're wearing right now. It's kind of this puffy jacket, right? And he kind of turns to him and he's like, no, actually, he was like, do you know where I got this? And I think the reporter mentioned some expensive name store. And he says, no, I got this at Macy's. He's like, they got a deal on them right now. You should go check it out. It's like $79. They got all the different colors and things like that. And it really kind of brought up the fact that here's a guy who just signed a $10 million contract, yet he's not going out there and blowing his money. He's saving while he can. So I guess, Glenn, the big question for you as a financial advisor, and I'm sure that maybe you are someone who's listening right now and you're thinking to yourself, well, what about the spend process when I get to that place in my retirement? I'm sure you've got clients that maybe they were the type that they live very well within their means. And you might have to tell them every once in a while, hey, it's okay. You can actually spend in your retirement.
Well, having an abundance of resources doesn't change who you are.
Right.
The habits you develop, they don't go away until somebody chooses to change their habits, financial or otherwise. They're going to continue doing what they've always been doing.
Right.
So when someone comes into a $10 million contract, I offered to do it for $8 million, by the way.
Right.
It doesn't actually change who they are. So their patterns still stay the same.
Right.
Unless they let the money get to them.
Right.
And that's where over time, having an abundance of resources will reveal their underlying character. So you break down looking at this a little bit. He just signed the contract.
Right.
So his habits haven't changed. Let's revisit it in 5-10 years and see if those resources actually did change his patterns.
Have you ever worked with someone, though, and let's say that they kind of did come into a large sum of money, or maybe that when you first got to know them, they didn't necessarily have a ton of money or whatever the case, and then they move forward into the future and due to saving, due to being very frugal, they have now a big nest egg, so to speak. Is there ever a time when you're like, hey, you could actually, indulge yourself a little bit?
And that's a matter of increasing your financial education.
Right.
See, there's risk tolerance and there's risk ability. Most financial advisors and brokers, they care a lot about your risk ability because if they're making recommendations that you feel comfortable with, they've limited their risk of getting sued. Now, as a fiduciary, I actually care more about somebody's risk ability than their risk tolerance, because as their financial education increases, their risk tolerance will conform to their risk ability.
Got it. Okay.
And that works on both ends of the spectrum. For example, you find somebody that's in their 60s, so they've got $50,000 in the bank, and they're more than happy to spend all of their Social Security check at the casino.
Right.
They've got a high risk tolerance, low risk ability.
Right.
And then you can find people that are in their 20s that inherit a tremendous amount of money, and all they want to do is keep it in cash or stick it under the mattress, and they're afraid to use it.
They're almost afraid for it to start working for them, so to speak.
Right. So there's somebody with a higher risk ability with a lower risk tolerance. So when it comes to actually spending your money and actually enjoying it, realize that whatever you spend money on, it really doesn't matter all that much as long as, if you can afford to do it, it's fine. If you earn the money and you spend the money on it and you want to enjoy something, good. That's what it's there for. Let's look at it this way. The streets of heaven are paved with gold. So if you've got a gold watch, as far as God's concerned, well, it's made out of pavement.
Right. It's the same. It's the same either way, right?
Right. It's just stuff. It's a matter of having an emotional detachment from it. And so when you have the resources, use them. I like to say that with every blessing comes a burden.
Mm-hmm.
when you have a lump sum of money, whether you've earned it or acquired it, inherited it, whatever, it's now under your authority. What you do with it, that's the reflection of your own character.
So let's talk about Keon Coleman here again just for a second. And yes, he was kind of discussing what his current pattern is, which is he's a saver, it seems. Now he's got $10 million. But if he were to stay in that same mindset of saving for the long haul, what are those advantages of putting together a retirement plan early versus waiting or doing it later? Maybe you think that you're, 50, 55 years old, and you think you still have plenty of time. Are there advantages to getting into that, scope now, or should they wait?
You could take a simple calculator and do some compound interest math.
Yes.
And it's very clear. The sooner you start, the better off you are. Simple, basic math.
Right.
But when we look at the pattern people go throughout their life, when they're in their 20s, generally speaking, if they have $20 or $50 in their pocket, they're going to have a good weekend. And then they're in their 30s, and now they're getting married, having kids, having a family, buying a house, getting new cars. They're accumulating all of this stuff.
Sure.
And then in their 40s, they say, okay, now I'm going to pay off the house, pay off the cars, pay off the bills, and finally really get out of debt. That's when they start paying attention to it. And then in their 50s, that's when they're like, oh, geez, now I've really got to start saving for retirement now. And, I guess I got to pay for that kid's college education too. And 60s rolls around, and then it's what happened. And that's where the whole process of saying if you start when you're young and you're putting aside 10 to 15% of all you earn from the day you start working, by the time you're in your mid-60s, everything will be fine.
Correct.
And that is completely true, as long as nothing bad happens.
And life happens, so there are the possibilities that bad could happen, right?
Right. And so that's where digging your well before you're thirsty comes into play.
Sure.
Are you properly positioned so that when life happens and something does knock you off your feet, you're equipped to be able to handle it mentally, emotionally, physically, and financially?
You know what? You just brought up a question that I had, and this is kind of a curveball to throw at you. But you mentioned, did I pay for my kids' college or have I paid for college and things like that? I'm just going to throw a scenario at you, just to, as far as the early planners versus someone who may be planning a little later. Let's say that you're 50 years old and you've got kids that are going to be needing a college fund, let's say down the road, maybe in the next 10 years. And you're 50, but you don't have much saved. And you're kind of faced with this dilemma. Do I save for my retirement, or do I save for my kids' college? Or is there a possibility of being able to do both successfully?
Yes. If you keep doing what you're doing both successfully may not happen.
Right.
But then you have to prioritize, and taking care of your own responsibilities and fully funding your own retirement becomes a greater priority than funding your kids' college education. And this is where getting good advice makes a difference. I saw a video the other day of Kamala Harris. She was instructing people to go get a home equity loan to pay for their kids' college education. I can't think of that. There's bad advice out there, but that's probably about as bad as it gets.
Okay.
So when planning, you obviously want to invest in your children, you want to properly prepare them for life, but our example, the decisions that we make for ourselves, is that much more important. It's kind of like, if I want the kids to go clean their room, I should go clean the garage.
You should show them how to do that by your own actions. Lead by example, I guess, is kind of the message there.
Right. And so that's why so I go through a priority list. Number one is cash flow. You've got to have more coming in than going out every month. If your cash flow is negative, it's just a matter of time and you're upside down. The next thing is emergency reserves. If the furnace breaks, can you fix it? If the roof starts leaking, can you fix it? If your car breaks down or you need a new car, do you have the cash to pay for it? So once your cash flow is positive, your emergency reserves needs are met, then you look at your future income. And that's where you start allocating and preparing so that you have the assets and the resources needed to fully fund your cash flow needs or retirement.
Right.
And then after your retirement plan is fully funded, then you can look at your estate. and what's getting left behind. And the examples that we set about making responsible decisions and caring for ourselves, and becoming as little of a burden as possible, that's an example that we can be passing on to our kids. We had to work, my parents had to work, and guess what? Mm-hmm. So do my kids, and that's okay.
And financial education, I think, is one of the things that is lost on kids. Regardless of generation, they don't teach you these types of responsible decisions or responsible leading. In school when you're, I don't know, let's say 13 years old, and you're a freshman in high school, or maybe you're still in junior high or whatnot. They're not teaching you how to make these decisions. And I think the other part that's a very interesting to this particular scenario about how you go about planning early, and that is that if you are not planning early and you have gotten into a situation where you have to make the decision, do I save for my retirement or my kids' college? There is some potential there that if you're having that conversation, let's say even with your kids, and they come to you and say, well, why didn't you save for my college? And I got to think that, well, because if I didn't save for my retirement, you would be paying for my retirement down the road.
That's right. That's right. You can start saving when you can start saving. Right. And if you're later on in life, if you're in your 40s or 50s and you're taking an honest look at, do I have what it takes to retire? Saving is important to the extent that you have the right habits in place. Mm-hmm. But sometimes you need to get a little creative. Mm-hmm. If the plan is to, like I said, to save 10 to 15% of all you earn from the day you start working, and that works out as long as nothing bad happens, if there isn't a divorce, if there isn't a child that's thrown out on drugs, if there isn't a foreclosure, or whatever it is, or a sickness, if nothing bad happens, that works.
Right.
But then we have to look at, if you're later in life and you're behind the 8 ball, again, this is where it becomes important to get a little bit creative, because doing more of what doesn't work. We want to be responsible with what we have. I think of a story that when I first started out as a financial advisor, this is going back over 20 years ago, I sat down with a couple. They were both medical doctors, and they had recently bought a 20,000 square foot house.
Oh, wow.
Fully furnished. I'm driving up and I'm thinking, boy, this is going to be an exciting plan. And the wife, she said, apparently they ran into some financial trouble because she had to stop working. And I asked them, I said, so what's the problem here? You've got a beautiful house, all brand new furniture. And they said, well, this is what we did. We cashed in all of our 401k money. We paid the taxes on it so that we could afford to put the down payment on this house, this 20,000 square foot house on 37 acres of land. And then they went out and got every store credit card they could to buy the furniture that they needed to be able to furnish it.
Right.
And now that she's not working, they said, well, I needed to use my mother-in-law's rental income in order to requalify and refinancing the house. And so I asked them, because they said they were struggling to pay for groceries.
Yeah.
I said, well, what are you going to do? You've got to do something differently. And their response has been burned into my memory forever. And they said, well, we can't do anything else. We're doctors. What would our neighbors think?
The mindset there. Yeah.
And the idea, the amount of pride that can come, that essentially the whole know it all, show it all, and owe it all comes into play. And, it was really tragic, because I kind of had to walk away, and I'm thinking, well, there's nothing I can do here to help, because as brilliant as they were intellectually and medically, financially, they had really dug a hole for themselves.
And so the planning that they could have done earlier or stayed with, they kind of disrupted that plan when they kind of made this decision to jump into something that was probably stretching their means. And then you have this life event. Somebody loses their job, or they're not able to work for whatever reason. And you got to be willing. An unwillingness to want to, I guess, maneuver, pivot, whatever you want to call it, that becomes a big part of your retirement plan, doesn't it?
And, and oftentimes somebody finds themselves in a unique financial situation. And actually, as common as the financial tools that we use in the industry, as common as the tools are for everybody, whose hands they're in make a big difference. Mm-hmm. And this is why when somebody gets themselves into a financial predicament, good or bad, knowing what to do to get out of it or to improve it makes all the difference in the world, because the advice that we get, if we're getting advice and we're not getting the answers that we want or what we need, chances are we're just talking to the wrong person.
Correct.
Because every situation that we're in, there's always a way out. So if somebody tells you that there's nothing you can do, well, you're probably talking to the wrong person, or the thing that you need to do, you just don't want to do it.
As a financial advisor, Glenn, I'm sure you probably find yourself in a situation where you're having to break news that maybe is not the most pleasant to hear. At the same time, the armchair quarterbacks out there, that you can always find somebody that's going to tell you what you want to hear. You can always find somebody that's going to tell you what you're hoping they would say, so that you can kind of almost base your decision on, well, we found out someone told us that it was a good idea to do this particular thing. Well, there's always going to be somebody who's going to tell you what you want to hear and give you the plan that you're hoping to hear. But that's not always the right plan, and that's not always the easiest news to hear. But having the right financial advisor is what's going to make the difference when the outcome, which is what comes later, comes into play.
That reminds me of a time a man came into my office and he said, "I think I have a lot of credit card debt." I said, "Oh, how much?" He said, "Oh, about $100,000. I said, "Well, have you added it up?" He said, "Well, no." He came back into my office and he had listed 42 credit cards, and I tallied it up. And I said, "Well, do you know how much you have here?" He's like, "About 100. I said, "No, $214,000 worth of credit card debt." And he was current on all 42 payments. And so now he was in his mid 70s or early 70s at the time. And I asked him if his wife knew about this. She said, "No. Will you tell her?"
So sometimes you have to play arbitrator. Right.
So I said, "Sure." So he a few days later, he brought her in. I broke the news to her. She slugged him, and we realized, okay, now what are we going to do from here? And fortunately, I've got the right relationships with the right people that could do the right things, and we were able to get every ounce of that cared for, settled. They're able to keep their house and live out the rest of their retirement years at home in good shape.
And together.
Yes, and together, and they stuck it through, and they made it through it.
That's awesome. And it takes the right kind of person to be able to be that liaison between the two in a situation like that. Well, listen, Glenn, great stuff there. And if you'd like more information on how Glenn can help you with your financial situation, especially if you're thinking about retirement, getting that plan together early so that you can start planning for what's to come down the road, and to also set yourself up into situations. Life happens. You can't necessarily always look at life as if nothing bad will ever happen. You kind of have to prepare. I'm not saying for the worst, but there's always the possibility.
That's right.
If you want more information, go to the website at jabezfinancial.com. This is the Manumet Podcast. You can find more episodes on the website at themanumetpodcast.com. For Glenn Johnson, financial advisor, I'm Jeff Miles. Thank you so much for listening.
Investment advisory services offered through Jabez Financial, LLC, a registered investment advisor firm. Registration is not an endorsement by securities regulators. By contacting us, you may be provided with information about insurance products, including annuities, offered through Glenn Johnson, Connecticut Insurance, license number 4628409. The firms are separate entities. Annuity guarantees rely on the financial strength and claims-paying ability of the issuing insurance company and are not offered by Jabez Financial, LLC. Read your contract for restrictions, limitations, or penalties. Jabez Financial, LLC is not licensed in all 50 states. To find out if Jabez Financial, LLC is licensed in your state, please call 860-390-0093.